Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it's Thursday, the 20th of March. The news, of course, is dominated by a certain Donald Trump. All sorts of news about him or his people, throwing people out of the country, attacking the government, doing all sorts of what seem to be very naughty things which some people think haven't happened before in history, although historians, of course, will remind us that everything has always happened in history, even in American history. Last year, we had my friend Adam Hochschild on the show. His book, American Midnight, The Great War of Violent Peace and Democracy's Forgotten Crisis, is a book which now appears increasingly prescient, which suggests that a lot of the paranoia, the red baiting, the putting in prison, the attacks on government happened immediately after the First World War in America. And history, perhaps in America, doesn't only repeat itself once, it repeats itself twice. My guest today, Clay Risen, journalist at the New York Times, has a very timely new book out, Red Scare, Blacklists, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America. And Clay Risen is joining us from his home in Brooklyn. Clay, how did you arrange history so conveniently so that Trump yesterday was talking about getting rid of what he called left lunatic judges? Did you pay him to say that?
Would that I could. No, look, I've been working on this book for 6 years, and really my interest from the beginning was historical, and with some sense of, there is a resonance and maybe a vibe out there, but it's gotten to the point where every day there's some news story or some tweet or whatever that makes me think that's exactly like this episode from my book. And in fact, I've had some reviewers say, hey, nice book, and you call it a history, but come on, you obviously wrote this book with the president in mind and, picked stories. And I wrote this, I finished the book a year ago. So it is just weird, very weird timing, I've got to say. And, just something unfortunate, I think, for a lot of reasons, but obviously people are interested in the book.
Well, given all these conspiracy theories, some people might think that Simon & Schuster has special powers since the book is...
I wish they did.
Yeah, well, it's going to be a big success. I wonder, I'm sure you're very familiar with Adam's book, American Midnight. In a sense, would it be fair to call your book a kind of second volume, although you begin around where Adam leaves off?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, look, I think one of the things that is important to recognize, whether it's today looking back at the 40s and 50s or the 40s and 50s looking back at the teens and early 20s that Adam focuses on, that while those periods ended, there were legacies, and some of those legacies are legal structures, some of them are unresolved tensions, and in interesting and not always obvious ways, but sometimes obvious ways, they pick up again. And so one of the things coming out of Adam's book and teeing into the period I talk about is the creation of an anti-radical, I guess you'd sort of call it an infrastructure within the government, the FBI being kind of at the center of that. And also the idea that it is part of the job of the government to police radical thought. And while that may have diminished a little bit in the intervening decades, it certainly came back in the Red Scare. And so you had kind of the resurgence of this way of thinking that probably most people thought had gone away. And I'd say you can probably, I mean, I would argue, say something similar about some of what we're going through today and what happened in the Red Scare. A lot of the legal legislative tools that the Trump administration is using, the Immigration Act of 1952, that was in part a Red Scare measure. I mean, a lot of it, if you look at the act, a lot of it is about policing and deporting people who don't think the right way, who might have said the wrong thing. And here we are again. We're doing the same thing.
History repeating itself. Your book got a lovely review in the New Yorker by Beverly Gage, who has an award-winning book, a massive book on J. Edgar Hoover. He's one of the figures who spans the two periods. You talk about the founding of the FBI. Of course, it was Hoover's institution for God knows how many years. Is J. Edgar the central character here? Of course, you cover McCarthy, you cover all sorts of other characters. Or would it be wrong, Clay, to personalize this and make it the story of individuals like J. Edgar Hoover and McCarthy, and obviously Eisenhower and Dulles and Truman and all the other figures you deal with?
Yeah, that was one of the challenges of writing the book, is that there is no real central character, although at any given moment, there is a dominant figure at the heart of that narrative episode. But I do think you're right that Hoover was absolutely integral to this, both the ideology that he brought to the FBI and government service, built around both an anti-radical stance, but also a very narrow vision of what Americanism was supposed to be about. And so there's a certain way you should think, and there's a certain way you shouldn't think, and a certain way you should act, and the kinds of people you should associate with. And if you didn't do those things, then you were a prima facie suspect. And Hoover had a list of names throughout the Red Scare who were, in the event of a war or some sort of conflict, were to be rounded up without due process, without any charges. They were just suspect individuals. And there was no vetting of that list. I mean, the idea of a list is abhorrent in itself, but also who was to say whether that list was accurate? But Hoover had that kind of power. And, fortunately, that never came to pass. But people who have gone back to their FBI files, if they were lucky or unlucky enough to have one, they can find out, were they on the list? And we're talking about thousands and thousands of Americans. And so, Hoover does loom behind the story as a sort of gray eminence, not the only one, and not necessarily at any moment the most powerful. But I think there's a through line to be seen. And certainly when we're talking about the power of the state and the power of the government to police thought and to police associations and to sort of define what's acceptable, the FBI is really the tip of the spear in that regard.
We did a show a couple of years ago with the author of Stasi Land, and this idea of the list raises the specter of the Stasi, of course, who were obsessed with collecting lists. In terms of comparing this paranoia in America with other countries, Clay, did you look at that in the book, or do you exclusively see this within purely or narrowly an American context?
Well, yeah, it was, I'd say the book itself is purely American. One of the things that did inspire me when I was first sort of thinking about the frame or sort of the inspiration for the frame, it's interesting that in Britain after the war there were spy scandals, and the Soviets were very interested in subterfuge and spying in Great Britain. In France and Italy, you had much stronger communist parties with direct ties to Moscow than in the United States. And yet, while all of those countries had anti-communist elements, there was nothing like what happened in the United States. And so I don't really bring in a comparative element into the book, but it was there in the back of my head. I think there's certainly, I think one can stand back and say, how does this compare with the Stasi or other Eastern European or Soviet bloc intelligence groups? I mean, but those are also operating within a totalitarian framework. I think the interesting thing for me with the American model is that the story is that it runs so counter to the things that we supposedly hold at the very center of our political identity, this idea of the Bill of Rights and privacy rights. And there is, the idea that the government has no place in our private lives. All of that was upended during the Red Scare.
There's so much here, Claes, so many interesting angles on this story. Richard Hofstadter, of course, famously wrote the essay, I'm not sure was it in the 60s, on the paranoid style of American politics. Does that reflect on this? Is this just another feature, a kind of cause and effect of paranoia, of witch hunts of one kind or another in America that have obviously been going on even before the foundation of the Republic?
Well, yes and no. I think it's incontrovertible that we are a country that occasionally flips out, so to speak. That there are these moments of paranoia, going back to the Salem witch trials or anti-Catholic conspiracy theories in the 19th century. And so I certainly don't deny that. I think that there's something there. I was less interested in sort of plumbing the depths of the American character, and more in trying to lay down the historical case for why did this happen, and why did it happen when it did, and why did it take the shape that it did. And so Hofstadter's essay was very helpful in terms of sort of spanning those two facts, right? That we can both recognize that there's this long history, and then also we need to settle down and sort of examine why this thing happened at this time. And Hofstadter also very usefully places it within a broader history of conservatism in the United States, and also the tension between conservatism and progressivism, which is also at the heart of my book. And so I borrow very liberally and hopefully honestly from him. It's a very useful construct.
In terms of that paranoia, I sometimes wonder whether it's invented or self-serving. Take, for example, J. Edgar Hoover. He was paranoid about American blacks. He was paranoid about Reds, but he wasn't paranoid about gays, because he probably himself was gay, as Beverly Gage so beautifully points out in his book. So my question is there a kind of convenience to the paranoia? I'm sure Joe McCarthy's paranoia, he was paranoid about the communists and the blacks, but not about the Catholics, because he himself was a Catholic. In other words, is there a kind of convenience to all this, and that the paranoia is somehow invented, or it takes place after a few glasses of whiskey?
I mean, yes and no. I think that there's an easy answer to why this happened when it did, which is that the Cold War set in, and regardless of what other countries were involved on either side, it pitted the United States against the Soviet Union. But it wasn't something that set in without any context. The United States had been at war, had been on a war footing domestically, where security was absolute. You had to be, black and white, and that carried over into the Cold War. But there was also a longer simmering tension between progressives and conservatives coming out of the New Deal era and the emergence of this kind of New Deal culture that was more cosmopolitan, more tolerant, more pluralistic, and more embracing of the government as a tool of change. So these things sort of exist in this, sort of slow, low simmering fight in the 30s and during World War II, and then are accelerated during the Cold War. And suddenly anything that reeks of radicalism is suspect. I'm reminded another thing that got me writing this book, and you mentioned sort of Hoover and his paranoias. My grandfather was an FBI agent during World War II and long afterward. But one of his assignments during World War II, he was in Chicago, and it was to go investigate any report of anybody who was suspected of being a radical or of being a Nazi. And so it cut both ways. And so he would get a call and someone would say, you should investigate Herr Schmidt or Mr. Schmidt. I think he's a Nazi. And he'd go investigate and interview Mr. Schmidt. And Schmidt would say, I'm not a Nazi. I came over as a child. My son is fighting in the army. That's
my best friends are all Jews.
Yeah, well, but then he'd say, but you need to go check out Mr. Landman. He is, a communist Jew. And so, okay, I'll go check him out, and he'd go investigate him and say, what are you talking about? I'm not a communist. I run a little shop here and yada, yada. And then my grandfather would go talk to other people, and they'd say, Schmidt and Landman, they're not radicals. They just hate each other. They've hated each other ever since they had a fight about their fence. And my grandfather would tell this story as this sort of funny, like, oh, hey, this is the kind of thing that I was doing. But it always stuck with me that, there was that kind of just that level of on the ground investigation. I mean, those aren't particularly invasive investigations, but you can imagine what else was going on, and profiling of millions of Americans on the basis of rumors. And, I think that's kind of the hallmark of the Red Scare, is that suddenly all bets were off in terms of what was allowed by the state and what people were forced to tolerate in terms of invasions of their private lives.
Oh, the book is called Red Scare rather than Pink Scare or Black Scare. And of course, though, a lot of African Americans were associated with the left, particularly all the investigations of Martin Luther King in the early 60s. Is there something about that? I mean, what came first, the Red Scare or the Cold War? I mean, the Soviet Union was a threat. It was a totalitarian regime. Joseph Stalin killed tens of millions of people. So some of the arguments in the Cold War are actually valid, weren't they, Clay?
Oh, of course. And I think it's really important. And another reason why I wanted to write my book is that previous histories of the Red Scare have largely been, very partisan, in the sense that they rejected any claim to the venality of the American Communist Party or the existence of spies within the U.S. government. Now there's pretty incontrovertible evidence that yes, there were spies in the U.S. government. The Rosenbergs really were guilty. This American Communist Party, not every communist, but the leadership, they really were beholden to Moscow and received money and helped with espionage networks. And so all of this has to be taken into account, along with, like you said, the real challenge of the Cold War. It really was a conflict that we could not avoid and needed to face. But again, I think that doesn't then justify everything that happened. And when you take sort of a realistic account of what the American Communist Party was doing, what the espionage networks were and what they weren't, they'd largely disappeared by the end of World War II. They were never very effective, with the Rosenbergs being an exception. All of this kind of suggests the need for a more measured response, and maybe a law enforcement counterintelligence response, not the kind of response that we had, which was widespread, millions of people being investigated, high school and elementary school teachers being fired, ministers being kicked out of their pulpits. I mean, you can go down the list of people who you couldn't really explain why it mattered, whether they were communists or radicals or whatever, but they were targets.
Yeah, I mean, many, as you say, many thousands, tens of thousands perhaps of ordinary lives were ruined by this. I know you write about Whittaker Chambers in this and his famous case with Alger Hiss. We had Alger Hiss's son on the show a couple of years ago. I didn't have the nerve to ask him about his father, but this did wreck the life of many, many people, didn't it, Clay?
Yes,
many talented people, less talented people. I mean, this was a tragedy, a catastrophe on lots of fronts.
In Hollywood, you talk about talented people. I mean, I was struck by how many rising stars in Hollywood that we've never heard of, because early in their careers, maybe they signed the wrong petition, maybe they signed up for the Communist Party, but oftentimes they were just sort of affiliated with the left, and were suddenly called forth to explain themselves and to name names. And those who didn't were blacklisted. And though the blacklist ended, people had to make money. A lot of them, having starred in Oscar-nominated films in their young life, suddenly found themselves selling used cars in Ventura County. I mean, lives changed dramatically, and for no obvious reason. whatever anyone thought was happening in Hollywood, it was not a threat to the Republic.
Yeah, and of course there was an Oscar-winning film a couple of years ago, Oppenheimer, about this. I know this was part of the narrative. What do you make of the Oppenheimer story within your Red Scare, Clay?
Well, I think the movie was really good. I think it was fantastic. But I think in this specific element, right, this sort of how does this story of Oppenheimer illustrate the venality of the Red Scare? I think the movie captured it very well. And one of the things that I think Oppenheimer really found himself caught in the middle of was he was someone who in the 1930s was politically idealistic, maybe politically naive, signed up for a lot of causes that other people were as well. And there remains debate about, did he ever join the Communist Party? Was he a secret communist? It's probably at the end of the day an unresolvable issue. But what's not at issue is that he did great things in the service of his country. And there is no evidence that he ever engaged in espionage, that he tolerated any modicum of anti-Americanism or subversion in the Manhattan Project. But what ends up happening to him is also what happened to a lot of other people, which is this pretext of, are you a spy? Have you ever been a communist? Became a wedge to push away people who didn't follow a certain line. And in Oppenheimer's case, it was he didn't agree on the need for a hydrogen bomb. He was happy. He accepted the existence of the atomic bomb. He understood that it was militarily useful, but he thought a hydrogen bomb was grossly immoral. And
it was Edward Teller, of course, who was the hydrogen bomb.
It was Teller,
champion.
and then Louis Strauss, who was played by Robert Downey Jr.
Yeah, it was a brilliant figure in the movie, anyway.
Yeah, who also came crosswise with Oppenheimer. And look, I never knew any of these guys, but I thought Robert Downey Jr. captured what I understood the essence of Strauss to be, that ultimately he was very strong in his political beliefs, but also very obsessed with his own power. And he saw Oppenheimer as a challenge to that. And so he destroyed him. And Oppenheimer is a famous case. It's really important what happened to him in and of itself. But it's also really important as an example of what happened to a lot of other people, both in the federal government and then also in pretty much any sector you can name. People who simply did not sit exactly in the right place. It's like a game of musical chairs almost. They found themselves pushed aside or at risk. Many of those who don't count among the victims should in some ways, because there was so much, people started shutting down and they stopped expressing themselves. So there was when we think about the 1950s as an era of conformity, it's not by coincidence. That conformity was impressed upon people. The need for conformity was impressed upon people by the existence and the experience of the Red Scare.
Yes, and I hadn't actually thought of that. It's an interesting point. It perhaps might have some implications, especially given the Trump's attacks on the universities. You had an interesting piece in Politico on what happened the last time a president purged the bureaucracy. Again, history repeating itself. You write extensively about that. But you remind us that it wasn't just a Republican president. You also talk about Harry Truman's responsibility for this. How bipartisan in many ways, Clay, was the Red Scare? Is it too convenient for progressives to simply suggest that it was a problem with Republicans? Certainly, Richard Hofstadter in Adam Hochschild in American Midnight notes that that the Palmer White House was in some ways much as responsibility of Wilson as anyone else.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think one of the things that people need to keep in mind is, first of all, that the two parties were not what they are today, right? They were less ideologically defined. And so you had a lot of conservative Democrats in particular who rallied behind the Red Scare.
Southern ones in particular.
Largely Southern, almost exclusively Southerners who saw communism as a wedge against civil rights and against the parts of the New Deal that they didn't like. And so you had that. You also had politicians like Harry Truman, who, Harry Truman was never a red baiter, but he did what he thought he had to do to essentially pay off or buy off the concerns of people like J. Edgar Hoover. And so he created a loyalty program that ended up being part of the juice, part of the fundamental, the original sort of flammable material that gave light to the Red Scare. But increasingly through the Red Scare, it became much more partisan, especially after Truman won re-election in 1949, where it became this. And he won in 1949 in part because his opponent, Thomas Dewey, refused to get into the mud. He refused to use communism as a political weapon, and very admirably, I think. But the Republican Party then looked at that and said, "Well, we're not going to do that again. We're going to use this as a weapon, and we're going to go after every Democrat, and we're going to attack them for being weak on communism." Well, at that point, it became very hard for anyone not to see this as a partisan issue. And by the time McCarthy came around in 1950 and really started hammering home this idea that there are subversives throughout the government, he's talking about the Truman government. And, so that it became a very partisan issue, whereas before it was a little more slippery.
McCarthy's principal aide was, of course, Roy Cohn. I'm sure you've seen the movie about Donald Trump's younger life, The Apprentice, which connects Trump and Cohn. Is this the bridge, McCarthy and Cohn, to MAGA America, Clay?
I think that there's a case to be made that Roy Cohn certainly had a lot of influence on Trump, obviously, as the movie and others have maintained.
What did you think of the movie? I thought it was great.
It was fantastic. And Jeremy Strong, right, played Cohn, phenomenal, really great. And I think it captured that very well. Now, I think that on some levels was more of the tactics that they inherited certain tactical applications, let's say, of McCarthyite attacks of McCarthyism. There are other elements that come down less through tactics and more through ideology, and more through this sort of philosophical construct about or conspiratorial. Philosophical is probably not the right word, but this sort of construct of there being this giant conspiracy within the federal government that is very much a part of the MAGA worldview today. It was very much a part of the Red Scare worldview back then.
How did the Kennedys come out of the story, Clay? Joseph Kennedy was, of course, a close personal friend, I think, of Joe McCarthy. He even got a job for his son, Bobby Kennedy, when he came out of law school. He went to work for a time with McCarthy and was actually rather fond of him.
Yes.
JFK, of course, was sympathetic, I think, in many ways to the Red Scare. The Kennedys also another example of the bipartisan nature of this Red Scare?
To some extent. I think I would focus on John Kennedy in this question more than Bobby, and that's because I think one of the things that happened during the Red Scare is that progressivism even the mainstream progressivism became kind of a dirty word, and a lot of politicians in the Democratic Party moved very quickly to the center, and the center valorized those politicians who picked up a conservative bent, and John Kennedy was part of that. And I think for him it was part of his nature. It came from his father. The Kennedys, Teddy aside, were not especially liberal. They were known much more as centrists. I think in the White House, they started to change a little bit. And I think, you can see sort of the arc of Bobby Kennedy's career and transit toward much more open leftism or liberalism after his brother was killed. But no, you're right that there is there's something to be said about the way that John F. Kennedy uh, navigated this and really spoke out against communism more aggressively than some others, and supported legislation that helped undergird the Red Scare. He himself was not really a red baiter, though. He didn't go after communists or alleged communism. You look at someone like Nixon. Nixon very famously ran his 1950 campaign for Senate against Helen Gagan Douglas on some pretty disgusting red baiting tactics, and really just accusing her of all kinds of things that she didn't do and points of view that she didn't hold. And he ended up trouncing her. Kennedy never did anything like that.
Your colleague at the Times, David Leonhardt's written a wonderful book about the crisis of the American dream. I'm sure you're familiar with that book too. And he's in some ways critical of the new left, who he sees as splitting the Democratic Party off from the working class. In your narrative of the Red Scare, is the new left itself and its breach with the old Democratic Party, is it a reaction in some ways to the paranoia of the old Democratic Party?
It's interesting. I mean, I've had this conversation, versions of this, with some other people recently, and there is this sort of interesting generational dynamic where the right tends to not they don't sort of, younger Republicans or conservatives tend not to just sort of almost knee-jerk go after their elders, whereas the Democrats or liberals tend to do that. And so the new left really dug into the old left in a variety of ways. And I think David probably is right in that regard, but it's almost sort of a foregone conclusion that that's how Democrats work.
Clay, what does all this tell us then about what Democrats should do in response to Trump? Obviously, the Democratic Party, if anything, is in more crisis than the current Republican Party, although
I'd say so.
You're the obituary writer for the New York Times, your day job. Maybe you should be doing obituaries for both parties. But are there lessons? I mean, I want to, of course, come to the lessons of the Red Scare more broadly in America today, but are there lessons for how the Democratic Party should be dealing with the current Red Scare 2.0 of Trump?
Yeah, someone I won't take credit for this, but a reader wrote to me the other day and said, "This is if we had the Red Scare, then now we have the Blue Scare." And right. I think that's an apt way to put it, because
you need to write. That's your next book, the Blue.
Yeah, Scare. Right. Give that guy some royalties. But I think that's what's going on right now. Is it's not that there's some enemy out there, another country or this looming ideology. It's more just this collection of accusations about the left broadly. I think one lesson from the Red Scare is that one of the things that happened during the Red Scare that was very detrimental to the left is that they really went after each other. And you saw this most pointedly in the union movement, where the AFL-CIO, or the CIO at the time, it hadn't merged with the AFL yet, but the CIO was more industrial. They purged all the leftists, all of the communist sympathizers, upwards of 1 million members, through their unions, were purged from the CIO, and some of them still exist, some of them withered, but it fractured the movement. And while it was fair to say that some of the communists in the movement were not putting the interest of the workers ahead of their ideology, many of them were very much union men. And instead of working that out, there was this civil war. And same thing happens at all sorts of points through the history of the left, this sort of civil war, fighting each other, where again, conservatives tend to have they sort of figure it out a little more cleanly. So I would say today, if there's any lesson, it is don't try not to waste all your energy fighting each other. fights have to happen, and things need to be cleared up, and I completely understand that. But there is a point where it becomes counterproductive to fight each other when there is a common challenge out there to the left.
It's always struck me that there's a bullying quality to all these things, and they pick on the weakest people first. My friend David Maschiottra wrote an excellent piece for Salon on what he calls the Democrats' shameful retreats on trans rights. We did a show on this. In the period you write about, there were legislation about homosexuals, and I'm quoting from the Senate document, other sex perverts in government.
Yeah.
Is that what's happening today, Clay? That the trans are very much in the crosshairs of MAGA because they are the weakest people, the people least able to fight back.
Oh, for sure, for sure. I mean, that's what bullies do, right? Is they go after the weakest. I mean, I do think that bullying is a tactic. I think it's not an end in itself, although for some people they enjoy it. They're sadistic. But for others, it's just a means to power. And so you pick on the weakest, and you pick on people who maybe are the most vulnerable, but they also have claims to the values of some other group, right? So trans people in America, make legitimate claims to uphold or to be part of the vision for justice that Democrats tend to uphold. And so by going after them and making them a political liability, you make Democrats sort of have to choose. Well, do we stand with our values, or do we cut them off because politically it's more expedient? And I think that's where that bullying really becomes very useful for opponents, because it creates those points of dissension. And I think that's one of the things that does run through history, is that this is not, these fights internal to the left are not always just sort of sui generis. They're often inspired by bullying from the right. And Democrats or liberals, they tend to take the bait very often.
Yeah, they're rather weak. I hope Gavin Newsom will read your book, Red Scare. Claire, I hope you send him a copy. He is a reader, although maybe he chooses what he reads. How do the current pinups on the right, the J.D. Vances and the Josh Hawleys, even the sort of fathers of contemporary conservatism or insurgent conservatism like Pat Buchanan, how do they fit into the Red Scare narrative? Are they simply, just as Trump might be a repeat of everything you write about, are people like Vance and Hawley and Buchanan, are they just replicas of what happened before, of the McCarthys and Cohns?
Well, whether they intend to or not, I think they pick up on certain things. Certainly, if you look at some of the interviews that Vance has done, especially before he became a senator, when he was radicalizing, in some of these interviews with right-wing podcasters, he talked a pretty radical game himself, radically right-wing, talking about the need to roll back the New Deal, the need for restrictions on democracy, the need for a real wholesale cultural and religious revolution in the United States. And so I think he fits in that regard. I think the Red Scare and kind of everything we've seen since has been defined by a fight against, the values and ideas and structures that came out of the New Deal. And so Vance is sort of the latest version of that. But also I'm struck by how often he uses what I would consider to be McCarthyite tactics. This came up especially last year during the witch hunt around Haitians who were supposedly eating dogs in Ohio. And the whole thing was ridiculous. But someone asked him and said, look, it's incontrovertibly wrong that this is happening. And he had two responses that I thought were very telling. First of all, he said, because he had repeated these things. And he said, first of all, it's not my job to decide whether this is true or not. I'm simply repeating what's been said. It's your job as the media to figure that out. Well, that McCarthy said that kind of thing all the time. But the other thing he said was, it doesn't actually matter if I'm telling the truth or if there's any truth to this or not, because the larger truth is absolutely correct, right? The idea that immigrants are bad and we need to get rid of immigrants, and so if this lie is in service of this bigger truth or this bigger goal, then that's okay. And that is absolutely not just what McCarthy said, but it's what a lot of McCarthy's supporters said. People who knew better, right? Who knew that he was making stuff up. But they would look and say, you know what? But he's doing the right thing, and he's maybe loose with the truth, but he's fighting the right fight. And I think that's a very dangerous road to go down. And it's one thing to see it in the hands of someone like McCarthy, who, as powerful as he was, remained a senator from Wisconsin with a pretty short expiration date on his career. Vance is vice president, and there's every reason to believe he'll be the presidential nominee in.
He doesn't have a drinking habit like McCarthy.
Yeah,
not
yeah,
one
exactly.
we know about.
Probably
I'm
really
sure you're
long.
familiar with John Gantz's book, When the Clock Broke. He was on the show as well.
I've got it right here.
Yeah, it's another excellent book.
Yeah.
In terms of Buchanan, what do you make of Gantz's thesis on the Klan and Buchanan and the early 90s? Is that, we keep on talking about bridges, we probably should bring up Bill Clinton with his obsession with bridges, but is that the bridge between these two worlds, the early 90s, David Duke, Pat Buchanan?
Mm-hmm. I think it's absolutely a bridge. It's an important moment. And if you look at Buchanan's 1992 speech at the Republican National Convention, it's full of conspiracy theories and full of nativism and this sort of othering of all kinds of people. And it's drawing directly on that rhetoric that was widely widespread during the Red Scare. This idea that the enemy is among us, and it's up to true Americans to do something about it. That is part and parcel of Buchanan's message, and he had his particular take on it. Goldwater before him treaded in some of the same rhetoric. He had a slightly different version, but it's always this through line cutting along. And I think it's not coincidental that it sort of begins in the Red Scare, or I begin my story in the Red Scare, and it cuts down to today. There's a genealogy to this that's once you see it, it's hard to miss.
Finally, Clay, you've been very generous with your time. The subtitle of the book is Blacklists, McCarthyism and the Making of Modern America. So it struck me that the McCarthy period ended very suddenly, or it seemed to end very suddenly, which you cover in the book. Is that fair? And should we expect, I'm sure this is the question that everybody's asking you, should we expect a similarly sudden, sharp end to this, like a nightmare where we suddenly all wake up and realize, just with Joe McCarthy and McCarthyism, that this is completely absurd and self-destructive and we need to get beyond it?
Perhaps. I mean, McCarthyism ended, or the era that we call McCarthyism, and ended in part because he imploded. But it also mattered that the Korean War ended in 1953. Joseph Stalin died in 1953. The Cold War kind of set in. And also, it became radically apparent by then that there was no there. The Communist Party was not a threat in the United States. So the Communist Party had itself imploded. And so that really took a lot of the heat out of the oven. But could that have been predicted ahead of time? I don't know. There was no one sitting around in 1950 saying, here's exactly what's going to happen to kind of bring this to an end. So today it's hard to measure. I mean, God forbid, let's say something happened to Trump, and he is the linchpin of the MAGA movement. As much as he has remade the party in his own image, I'm not sure that without him, or with his sudden disappearance, things would hold together. It might be sort of like, Alexander's empire after the death of Alexander. Everything splits apart and makes way for the Romans. I don't know. Maybe it's more like, McKinley died and suddenly Roosevelt rose, and Roosevelt was Theodore Roosevelt completely rewrote the terms of American politics. And maybe that happens in this case, and J.D. Vance suddenly rises to the occasion and rewrites the terms. I don't know. That's ultimately the hardest thing to answer, because, of course, it's yet to be realized. But I think one can speculate about a number of different ways. It's hard. I will say this: it is hard to imagine the MAGA movement, the Republican MAGA movement, being a permanent part of the American landscape as it is, because it's so radical. And it's, especially in this second Trump administration, it's pushing so much further than the American people expected, that I think they'll tolerate in the long run. And so I think there's going to have to be some sort of push and pull back to the center. American politics are centripetal in that regard. And right now we are being run by a very radical Republican Party. And I just don't think that will last. But I don't know how it ends. I wish I had a better answer, but then if I did, I wouldn't be doing what I do. I'd be in Vegas.
Well, you probably wouldn't be in Vegas. You'd be in Hollywood. You'd be
or in Hollywood, yeah.
I mean, a screenplay writer would end it with a confrontation between Trump and perhaps John Roberts on the Supreme Court, or perhaps with an American general. Are those, finally, Clay, are those the most likely backstops against all this, the two institutions, either of the law or of the military?
Well, God forbid the military, but the law for sure. And that was certainly the thing, aside from McCarthy falling, it was ultimately the Warren court, the Earl Warren's court, that, to the surprise of a lot of people in 1953, became, or not immediately in 53, but let's say by 1954, really became a stalwart force for civil liberties, but desegregating schools and essentially ending Jim Crow, but also bringing the legal architecture of the Red Scare to heel. And then much later defending, all kinds of other Miranda rights and all kinds of other, right to counsel, really putting into shape the civil liberties landscape we have today. And so, again, I think today we could be very surprised by what the Supreme Court ends up doing and how it ends up paring back some of what we're seeing now. But again, I mean, I'd hesitate to place a large stack of chips on that.
Well, you're a historian. You're never going to put a stack of large chips on anything. But essential reading: Red Scare, Blacklists, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America. Uncannily prescient book about not just Trump's America, MAGA's America, but America in general and American history. Congratulations, Clay, on the book. And I'd love to get you back on the show, because this story
anytime
certainly hasn't ended yet. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.